Your most cherished belief that you own your own mind is a luxury afforded to you only because the experiments stopped, not because they failed. We often tell ourselves soothing historical lies, painting the CIA's infamous Project MK Ultra as a dark, bizarre anomaly, a misguided LSD trip led by Cold War paranoia, easily dismissed as 1950s government overreach. This comfortable simplification is precisely the shield that prevents us from grasping the true philosophical horror of what happened. MK Ultra was not simply about weaponizing psychedelics. It was the largest, most cynical, and most state-sanctioned exploration into the structural weakness of the human soul ever attempted. The agents weren't looking for a secret drug. They were looking for the off switch to identity itself. They wanted to prove, definitively, that the human personality is not an inviolable spirit, but a programmable system, an operating system prone to crashes, exploits, and total reinstallation. This is the central, unpalatable thesis we must confront. MK Ultra succeeded in its core objective. It did not create a platoon of perfect sleeper agents, but it did map the architecture of mental fragility. It proved that given the right combination of chemical stress, psychological pressure, and sensory annihilation, any human consciousness can be fractured, disassembled, and reduced to a pre-verbal suggestible state. If you are tired of comfortable histories and shallow, sanitized answers about the nature of human freedom and control, then this is your moment. Hit that subscribe button now. This is where we stop whispering about the historical facts and start analyzing the dark mechanics they uncovered. The project began in 1953, a sprawling, chaotic network of sub-projects spanning major universities, hospitals, and even prisons. Its goal, cryptically defined, was the mastery of behavioral control through chemical, biological, and radiological means. But the true, horrifying genius of MK Ultra lay in the realization that chemistry was only the catalyst. The real tool was trauma. The scientists involved, many of whom were ironically recruited from the dark corners of wartime psychiatry, understood that the most effective way to rewrite a personality is first to achieve total ego death. They were not attempting to persuade or debate their subjects, they were attempting demolition. Consider the protocols executed by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, often cited as one of the most egregious sites of abuse. Cameron, a brilliant psychiatrist fueled by Nobel ambitions and a terrifying certainty, believed he could cure mental illness by erasing the patient's existing personality and replacing it with a healthy one. This wasn't therapy, it was psychic carpet bombing. He pioneered techniques he chillingly termed psychic driving and depatterning. Depatterning involved massive doses of electroshock therapy, up to 40 shocks in a single month, combined with drug-induced coma lasting weeks, sometimes months. Subjects were perpetually held in a sensorily deprived state, often bound, blindfolded, and pumped full of barbiturates until they were effectively human vegetables. The goal was to induce infantile regression. Cameron sought to melt down the complex structures of adult memory, identity, and moral judgment until all that remained was the raw clay of a mind barely capable of functioning. Once the patient was reduced to this blank slate, a state of profound dependency and amnesia, Cameron initiated psychic driving. This involved looping recorded messages through headphones worn 24 hours a day, sometimes tens of thousands of repetitions of simple commanding phrases, often designed to reinforce new behavioral loops or install deep, unconscious guilt. The results were not the cured, healthy patients he promised. They were shells. Victims emerged with wiped memories, complete amnesia of their lives, and severe, irreversible psychological damage. Their families were told they were receiving experimental, cutting-edge treatment. In reality, they were sacrifices on the altar of state paranoia, guinea pigs proving the malleability of human consciousness. What the files reveal is a chilling confirmation of nihilistic philosophy, that our sense of self is merely a persistent illusion maintained by environmental constancy and the unbroken chain of memory. When the environment is surgically hostile and the memory chain is deliberately snapped by drugs and electric current, the self dissolves. The soul, if you wish to call it that, is less a divine spark and more a house of cards. And the men running these projects, the doctors, the CIA handlers, the financial officers, understood this vulnerability better than any philosopher of their generation. They looked into the abyss of human nature and saw not dignity, but code waiting to be overwritten. This knowledge, purchased through unimaginable human suffering, did not vanish when the project was officially terminated in the 1970s. It simply went underground, internalized by the systems of power that learned the hard lesson. To control a person, you don't need to defeat their will. You just need to erase their foundation. The suffering of these test subjects transcends mere physical or temporary psychological pain. It was the ontological shattering of their being. When the raw clay of the mind is exposed, the subsequent suffering arises not from the lack of memory, but from the horrifying realization that identity is a construction that can be dismantled, leaving only a residue of anxiety and terror. Identity is fundamentally a recursive narrative we tell ourselves, a story constantly reinforced by familiar faces, familiar walls, and the physical evidence of our past choices. When the foundation of that narrative is vaporized, when the patient wakes up possessing a body, a set of skills, and learned behaviors, but absolutely zero context for why those things exist, they are effectively forced to live as ghosts, haunting a life they never lived. They become perfect victims of existential vertigo, adrift in a temporal sea where every action feels unearned, every emotion unmoored, and the past is an abyss that stares back, offering no anchor. This absolute lack of self-context is precisely what facilitated the implantation of new, toxic programming. The mind, desperate to fill the vacuum of meaning, becomes horrifyingly receptive to any narrative offered, even one of profound self-loathing. Psychic driving didn't just delete memories, it installed a viral, self-executing narrative of inadequacy, guilt, or compliance. Imagine waking up with the certainty that you are a fundamentally bad person, yet having absolutely no memory of the transgression that earned you this judgment. The inability to reconcile the feeling of unforgivable sin with the absence of the causative event creates a psychological engine of perpetual conflict. The victims became their own internal jailers, policing themselves against crimes they couldn't remember committing because the shame was real, even if the memory was manufactured. This truth, that the self can be hollowed out and rewritten by external malice, is the darkest knowledge held by those who seek control. If you feel compelled by the terrifying implications of this research, if you want to ensure you never miss an essay that dares to illuminate the hidden mechanics of power and the true fragility of human consciousness, you absolutely must hit that subscribe button right now. We must keep the light trained on these shadows. The doctors and their state handlers discovered that the will is not defeated by overcoming it, but by severing it from its historical roots. True control is not enforced by chains, but by giving the victim a newly fabricated set of internal limitations, enforced by a relentless, free-floating dread. When a person's foundation is shattered, they lose the ability to differentiate between their authentic internal state and the external programming that has been poured into the void. They suffer because they are perpetually in the process of rebuilding a self upon quicksand. They are trapped in a self-referential paradox. To heal, they must remember who they were. But the mechanism of their suffering is the deliberate and surgical destruction of that memory. The sheer effort required to maintain this level of psychological analysis, to trace the lineage of these horrific experiments from the cold labs of the 1950s into the modern systems of control, is immense. If you find value in this depth of uncompromising analysis, If you believe that this relentless pursuit of uncomfortable truth deserves support, then subscribing is the simplest and most vital way you can support this work and guarantee that these deep, dark investigations continue. What remained after the psychic driving was not a blank slate, but a highly pressurized, fragile ego shell containing a volatile mixture of induced guilt, learned helplessness, and a catastrophic lack of identity cohesion. This is why the trauma was irreversible. You cannot treat a patient whose illness is the absence of a self to treat. They were not merely damaged, they were fundamentally incomplete, perpetually searching for the missing piece of their story in a hostile world. This understanding that a stable self is an environmental construct and a constant act of reaffirmation is the core, cynical lesson that the intelligence agencies learned and perfected. They learned that the most effective way to eliminate dissent is not to crush the body, but to dissolve the internal architect of resistance, the coherent, self-aware identity. And this principle, refined through the unimaginable agonies of innocent men and women, did not stay confined to the interrogation rooms of the Cold War. It became the foundational knowledge for all subsequent forms of social manipulation, psychological warfare, and the subtle, pervasive control mechanisms that operate today, hidden in plain sight. They knew that if you control the narrative, you control the man, but if you erase the man, the narrative writes itself. This realization is the final, definitive verdict on the nature of power. Humanity, stripped of its narrative, is nothing more than malleable, suffering clay. And what is the laboratory for the shaping of this malleable, suffering clay today? It is not a basement facility in Montreal with a single disgraced psychiatrist. It is the ubiquitous screen we willingly carry, the algorithmic architecture of the modern public square, which has perfected the art of self-immolation by proxy. We confuse the performance of identity for genuine personhood, and the system exploits this vulnerability with clinical precision. The Cold War psychologists had to physically restrain their subjects and blast them with noise for weeks to induce a regression. The modern control mechanism merely needs to present an endless, personalized stream of optimized anxiety, tailored outrage, and comparative metrics of inadequacy. This is not mere distraction. This is psychic driving delivered at the speed of light, personalized to the individual's deepest insecurities. The function is identical to Cameron's horrific experiments, to prevent the stabilization of a coherent self by ensuring the internal narrative is perpetually interrupted, replaced, and invalidated by external demands for performance and conformity. Look at the collective result. We now exist in a state of engineered vulnerability, where the boundaries between the self and the projection of the self have dissolved entirely. The trauma is now endemic, manifesting as a pervasive, low-frequency hum of anxiety that forces the subject to constantly seek external validation or narrative resolution from the very system causing the distress. This learned helplessness is the crown jewel of the intelligence community's legacy. It is the realization that a population perpetually engaged in self-monitoring and external validation requires no guards, no walls, and no overt oppression because they police themselves, frantically adjusting their internal state to match the shifting demands of the algorithmically generated environment. The crisis is not just that we are being watched. The crisis is that we are being written by the watcher, moment by moment. The brutally honest real-world example of this perfected control mechanism is the modern political polarization machine, which operates less like a debate and more like a mass dissociative episode. Identity is reduced to a set of pre-approved political triggers, and any deviation from the assigned script, any attempt at nuance or independent thought, is met with instant social ostracization. The goal is not political victory. The goal is the destruction of the individual's capacity for ambiguous, self-authored moral reasoning. We are trained to feel profound, existential threat not from physical danger, but from disagreement with our assigned ideological tribe. This manufactures a state of perpetual psychological mobilization, mirroring the high-stress, high-compliance environments engineered in the labs of the past. The difference is only scale. The modern subject is not seeking a stable reality. They are seeking their next instruction set, their next justified outrage, their next prescribed emotion, because their internal emotional thermostat has been irreparably externalized. This kind of unflinching analysis, which refuses the comfortable lie and rips open the elegant, personalized mechanisms of control woven into the fabric of our daily lives, requires a dedicated focus that is aggressively counter-algorithmic. If you are one of the few who still believes that genuine intellectual resistance, the pursuit of uncomfortable, deep truth, is not only possible but necessary, and you want to support the creation of uncompromising content that refuses to play the digital game of superficiality and distraction, then I urge you to hit that subscribe button now. Your action is the simplest and most vital endorsement of depth over the endless, mind-numbing scroll. We must recognize that the most dangerous psychological operation ever conducted is the one that convinces the subject they are free while their every internal metric is being optimized for compliance. The identity dissolution techniques that began in the sterile secrecy of Cold War labs have successfully metastasized into the atmosphere itself, forcing us all to breathe the air of manufactured confusion. We are living inside the successful conclusion of the psychic driving experiment, and the only remaining question is whether we can find the narrative thread of self before the system finishes erasing the storyteller. But the most pernicious psychological lie of our current moment is the mandated worship of manufactured authenticity. We are told, incessantly, that the path to liberation lies in finding our voice, curating our truth, and expressing our unique, precious individuality to the widest possible audience. This is not liberation. It is the final brilliant stroke of co-option. True individuality, the kind that disturbs the status quo and forces painful internal reevaluation, is messy, contradictory, unpopular, and utterly unmarketable. The authenticity we celebrate today is merely a highly optimized aesthetic of rebellion, a predefined template of countercultural symbols that, when adopted, signals immediate tribal loyalty and confirms to the algorithms that you have accepted your role as a productive, predictable consumer of identity. We have mistaken the performance of individuality for individuality itself. We are encouraged to build complex online avatars, spending enormous emotional and financial capital refining a projection of self that is, by design, streamlined, polished, and free of the actual existential friction that defines a truly self-authored life. When you distill your life down to a series of easily digestible, morally unambiguous statements, when you filter out every thought that doesn't fit the approved narrative of your chosen group, you are not finding yourself. You are volunteering for psychic reduction. You are handing the editing keys to the crowd, allowing them to trim the fat of your complexity until only the palatable, compliant stereotype remains. The tragic irony is that the more desperately we strive to signal our uniqueness and depth through these hyper-curated channels, the more uniform and interchangeable we become, fitting neatly into the data categories that define our compliance quotient. The true self is that terrifying, contradictory voice that argues with all the external voices, the one that refuses to be categorized, the one that whispers inconvenient truths about the tribe you swore allegiance to yesterday. And that voice is precisely what the modern infrastructure is designed to suppress, pathologize, or commodify into silence. Any psychology that collaborates with the market to turn the search for self into a marketable product is not seeking your mental health. It is seeking your permanent integration into the system of control. This relentless demand for public, flawless self-expression is, in fact, a demand for eternal surveillance and internal censorship, forcing us to police our own minds for any thought crime against the prevailing cultural orthodoxy. The lie is that you are unique. The reality is that your carefully constructed uniqueness is merely a highly specific, predetermined demographic target. This kind of intellectual excavation, the refusal to accept the comforting narratives of self-help and market psychology, requires a rare level of persistence. It is far easier to scroll past, to assume the system is benevolent or that complexity is overrated. But if you have stayed with this analysis, if you recognize the necessary difficulty of maintaining an internal compass against this global drift toward simplification and ideological servitude, then you already know the value of this kind of uncompromising exploration. If you find yourself nodding not out of ideological affirmation, but out of genuine, sometimes painful recognition of an uncomfortable truth, then I ask you to support the continuation of this work. Please take a moment to subscribe, because sustaining the output of content that genuinely fights against algorithmic pressures and societal simplification is only possible with your dedicated support. We are building a rare archive of philosophical resistance, ensuring that depth and difficulty continue to cut through the noise, providing the necessary toolkit to rebuild the internal storyteller before the erasure is complete. The system rewards ease, affirmation, and simplification, but the path toward genuine self-possession demands confrontation with the difficult truth that our most cherished forms of self-expression are often just pre-packaged scripts of mass compliance, carefully engineered to make us feel rebellious while keeping us perfectly contained. The great psychological toll of this era, the gnawing anxiety that defines the contemporary experience, is the psychic exhaustion of maintaining a full-time, marketable, flawless narrative. We are no longer simply living, we are perpetually curating, editing, and distributing the acceptable version of ourselves, and the cost of this performance is the betrayal of the messy, chaotic, and therefore truly human interior. The suffering stems from the denial of contradiction. A genuine self is a kaleidoscope of incompatible impulses, dark humor mixed with sincere conviction, profound insecurity masked by moments of staggering competence. The system cannot monetize this complexity. It demands synthesis, clean branding, and emotional predictability. So we enter into a continuous state of internal conflict, where the highly visible, polished persona we project must wage constant, silent war against the unruly shadow we desperately try to hide. This is why generalized anxiety is epidemic. It is the existential feedback loop generated when the internal storyteller, the true author of your life, realizes it has been replaced by a PR firm whose sole directive is to maximize approval metrics. We are fundamentally dishonest with ourselves about our own motives, our own doubts, and our own true desires, because expressing them publicly would violate the terms of service of the approved self. This clinical dishonesty is the root of modern alienation. We mistake visibility for intimacy. We broadcast our most palatable moments to an audience of thousands, yet remain utterly unknown to anyone, including ourselves. The illusion of being seen, of having your existence ratified by a deluge of digital affirmation, is perhaps the cruelest psychological trick of all. It trains us to equate quantity of attention with quality of connection, leading to a profound, clinical loneliness where the self is both everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously overexposed and deeply hidden. The truly terrifying realization is that the moment you internalize the expectations of the crowd, the moment you begin self-censoring your thoughts before they even fully form, anticipating the reaction, the critique, the punishment, you have successfully installed the primary surveillance apparatus inside your own mind. You become your own most aggressive warden. The agony is not the external pressure to conform, but the self-inflicted violence required to crush the unique, inconvenient parts of your nature that do not fit the established script of ideological or market acceptance. Every genuine impulse deflected, every sincere doubt repressed, every complex emotion flattened into a clean, legible performance is a step further into psychological servitude. We suffer because we have substituted the difficult pursuit of personal meaning, a task that requires solitude, silence, and confrontation with one's own mortality, for the easy hit of public validation, a drug that ensures eternal dependence and delivers only temporary relief. The system doesn't want you to be healthy or happy. It needs you compliant, busy, and perpetually insecure enough to keep seeking external affirmation. Escaping this trap requires nothing less than an absolute and total psychic divorce from the necessity of being liked, admired, or understood by the surrounding culture. It demands the reconstruction of an internal sanctuary where truth, not public approval, is the singular currency. The ultimate verdict on this age is that the quest for permanent broadcasted authenticity has resulted only in a crisis of manufactured identity and the death of the inner life. We must choose now between being a well-packaged product or becoming a genuinely difficult, contradictory, and therefore truly free human being. If you have recognized the magnitude of this choice and found value in this uncompromising effort to understand the architecture of our control, then I invite you to join the community that supports this resistance. Subscribe now and ensure that difficult critical thought continues to cut through the noise of affirmation and simplification, providing the necessary tools to reclaim the territory of the self. The ultimate verdict on the crisis of the modern soul is that the external self is a liability, a vulnerability the system will always exploit. Freedom, therefore, is not an act of public declaration, but an act of private, absolute sovereignty. A deliberate, strategic withdrawal of psychological resource from the marketplace of approval. The man who needs nothing from the crowd is the only man who can truly stand against it. He has internalized the final, essential truth that your worth is not a function of your visibility. The terror and the glory of authentic existence is that your reality is measured only by the intensity of your own experience of it and by the unforgiving standards of your conscience. It requires the courage to sit in the rubble of your own self-destruction, accepting that the parts of you that truly matter will be invisible, misunderstood, or actively repulsive to the ambient culture. We must relinquish the childish fantasy of universal acceptance and embrace the cold, hard fact that the path to psychological integrity is paved with rejection. Only the individual who has achieved inner stillness, who judges his day based on the silent, internal fulfillment of his own difficult purpose, not on the notification count, is truly unreachable by the forces of control. This is the final frontier of resistance, to maintain a complex, difficult, living inner world, even if the result is complete social illegibility. We must cease performing for the empty theater of public opinion and begin living solely for the difficult, contradictory, and utterly unmarketable truth that resides within. If you recognize this necessity, if you understand that the deepest and most dangerous truths are found only by those willing to walk away from the lights and demand more than simplification, then join this community of difficult thinkers. Subscribe and commit to the ongoing, uncompromising labor of becoming a human being, not a brand. The alternative is silence. The ultimate verdict on the crisis of the modern soul is that the external self is a liability, a vulnerability the system will always exploit. Freedom, therefore, is not an act of public declaration, but an act of private, absolute sovereignty. A deliberate, strategic withdrawal of psychological resource from the marketplace of approval. The man who needs nothing from the crowd is the only man who can truly stand against it. He has internalized the final, essential truth, that your worth is not a function of your visibility. The terror and the glory of authentic existence is that your reality is measured only by the intensity of your own experience of it, and by the unforgiving standards of your conscience. It requires the courage to sit in the rubble of your own self-destruction, accepting that the parts of you that truly matter will be invisible, misunderstood, or actively repulsive to the ambient culture. We must relinquish the childish fantasy of universal acceptance and embrace the cold, hard fact that the path to psychological integrity is paved with rejection. Only the individual who has achieved inner stillness, who judges his day based on the silent, internal fulfillment of his own difficult purpose, not on the notification count, is truly unreachable by the forces of control. This is the final frontier of resistance. To maintain a complex, difficult, living inner world, even if the result is complete social illegibility. We must cease performing for the empty theater of public opinion and begin living solely for the difficult, contradictory, and utterly unmarketable truth that resides within. If you recognize this necessity, if you understand that the deepest and most dangerous truths are found only by those willing to walk away from the lights and demand more than simplification, then join this community of difficult thinkers. Subscribe and commit to the ongoing, uncompromising labor of becoming a human being, not a brand. The alternative is silence. The grand illusion of this digital age is that visibility equals existence. We are promised immortality through data streams, but the ultimate, chilling truth is that the only part of you that can never be commodified, tracked, or weaponized is the part that refuses to exist for anyone else. This is not a philosophy of self-help. It is a declaration of war against spiritual simplification. The verdict is definitive. You will either be processed into digestible content, consumed and discarded, or you will achieve the terrifying, magnificent solitude of the truly internal life. The system cannot touch what it cannot see, and it cannot see the depth of a self rigorously protected by discipline and contempt for the superficial. Look around you. The world offers infinite distractions and easy metrics for fake success, yet the price of admission is always your complexity. The final, essential task of life is the construction of a fortress around your soul, built from the material of deep understanding, painful honesty, and necessary indifference. Do not mistake the noise of the crowd for the voice of reality. The signal you are searching for is quiet, difficult, and comes only from within. It demands everything. It demands you abandon the hope of being loved by the masses and instead focus on earning the respect of your own reflection. That reflection, free from the distortions of the algorithm, will be the only judge that ever truly mattered. This path is inherently isolating, but you do not have to walk it alone. If you understand the profound danger of the external life and are ready to commit to the terrifying work of internal sovereignty, then stand with us. This is where the real conversation happens, where we refuse the easy lie. Subscribe now and join the small, necessary community committed to staying awake in an age desperate for sleep. The future belongs not to the visible, but to the deep. The definitive verdict is this: your internal life is the final frontier, and protecting it is the only true act of self-preservation left in the modern world. You must choose the terrifying labor of being misunderstood over the soul-crushing convenience of universal approval. That choice defines whether you are a person or merely a profitable echo. Therefore, refuse the spotlight. Refuse to let your magnificent, messy biography be reduced to a product description. The greatest possible rebellion you can stage is to become unmarketable, to be a depth that the system cannot fathom, a complexity it cannot process. Never forget, the silence you cultivate is louder than any algorithm. Be quiet, be dangerous, be yourself.